Hello everyone, welcome to From Nowhere to Nothing, Ontological Oxymorons. I'm your host, Joel Bouchard, a graduate student in education, and with me is Mr. Norman Gayford, a professor of English and philosophy. Survival was a much larger task in the ancient world than it is today. This fact is exemplified in numerous ways looking back at cultural mythologies throughout the world. We see the importance of gods and goddesses who can lead, who are wise, who provide, and who can conquer. Today we took a look at the latter, gods of war. Okay, so we've looked at God, kings of the gods. We've looked at goddesses of wisdom.
Yeah.
And, really probably the kind of gods that stick out most in mythologies are the gods of war. The god kings are pretty prevalent, but gods of war are usually right behind them. And in some cases, like with the Norse mythology, they're really not inseparable almost,
No, they aren't. And they're, as you know, there's more. Many systems have more than one god of war, which attests to the attraction to a particular culture of that idea. But we also have to confess, we're reading as youngsters, which is an old word, isn't it? But anyway, we're reading stories. We can read love stories and creation stories, and that's kind of cool, but it's sort of British. But then battles, and that's unfortunately that's still something that pulls us into a narrative.
Why do you think that is? What is that about? Even with the day and age we live in and whatnot, a lot of children's toys are still centered around violence or conflict or. What is it about that appeals to people?
There are so many possible answers, and I think that embedded in our very beings is this embrace of conflict. It's not that we always seek it, but our metaphors, our language is laced with the words of war. Everyone wants to be a warrior, or if you're talking to somebody who's gone through a bad time, you're being a warrior, or you're doing battle with something, or fighting this, or and as a true warrior that term gets used and all the different iterations that it arises in. But conflict is the very nature of storytelling. We don't have a conflict, we don't have a story, really. And It doesn't have to be a war level conflict, but...
Yeah, and I think that's a pretty good explanation because, I think at first blush, if you're going to kind of look at a socio-evolutionary view of humans through a Socratic lens, you're going to say, okay, well, probably the biological drive or inner, state of humans of life in general is to reproduce. So you'd almost think that like a lot of play, storytelling, metaphors, all those things would really involve more love or, a theme like that. But I think that the reason that probably isn't the case, it probably doesn't have much to do with, it could, I'm sure it has something to do with maybe social mores and that sort of stuff. But I think it might even have more to do with a point that you brought up, which is that, reproduction and love and those sorts of things, that tends to be a more single, solitary occurrence, whereas conflict is a daily thing. So, and even among those sorts of things, so even if you look at reproduction as the act and then the raising of a child, that can be a day-to-day thing. But even within that relationship, there's conflict. So, conflict does really seem to be something even more so than, life's ability to want to reproduce, to, propagate and do these things. Conflict really is even deeper embedded in life than those sorts of things.
I think so. Yeah.
So anyways, I guess that's sort of a tangent, right?
Yeah, that's okay. But you remember, how many times have I said and used this metaphor, probably wrongly, but I still like it. what's a tangent? A tangent is a line that connects two points that intersects with circles. So really, a tangent is a straight line. So if you go off on a tangent, you're going on a straight line.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah. We're getting somewhere.
I think so.
All right. So talking about gods of war, something that pops up a little bit is kind of with like the goddesses of wisdom. They're a pretty diverse group of characters.
Yeah.
You know, what we'll see is as we start looking at these guys, we'll see that again, there isn't a real template to them. And I think part of that is kind of like you mentioned, the majority of these cultures have multiple war gods. So these guys that we're looking at, they're not the be all end all of war gods.
No.
And they more represent a facet or an aspect of war. And I tried to kind of choose them in such a way that they represent different aspects.
Yeah, I like your choices. I think they're diverse.
Yeah. So, you know, as we're going through that, I'm sure that will come up. You know, like looking at Ares and Athena are a pretty good example because, you know, a lot of these guys, there's multiple war gods. Probably the closest to having, you know, just two would be the Greeks. You have Ares and you have Athena, where, you know, they really represent, you know, Ares is kind of the brutal, realistic, you know, kind of in the heat of the moment war, and Athena is more kind of the strategic, you know, conflict, you know, kind of aspect of it.
Yeah.
So we'll see all that as we get into it. And as well as we'll see the crossover, like I was mentioning in the beginning, where some of these war gods bear a lot of resemblance to the god kings.
Yes, they do.
So,
and are in some cases directly related to them, of course.
Yeah.
I'm the son of the king, and therefore
Right. And so they're an interesting group, and they're also, you know, pretty. There's some themes to these guys as we go into it, and a lot of them are pretty deep. There's some things where you see it and you think, oh, wow, like what is this trying to say? You know, and there's some interesting messages there.
Very much so.
It's kind of a metaphorical, or it's a sort of an analogy to what we were just talking about. How, you know, if you're just looking at life purely biologically and you're trying to determine what the root causes for some behavior are, you see conflict as really it has to be one of those first most integral parts of being even alive. I think some of these tropes or some of these things that you see reflected in the iconography of these war gods is very similar. You know, it's something that says this is very integral and very visceral to being a war god in a culture. You know,
okay, what weaponry is associated with you? Why that particular thing? What could that? You know, Okay,
so let's jump in. We'll start with Ares.
All right.
Sticking with our theme. So, why don't you give us the background on Ares?
All right. Well, so 12 goddesses who are the progeny of Hera and Zeus. Of those, Ares, as you said very well, is, well, let's say, how do we put it in 21st century terms? Ares is the ultimate bad boy, stubborn, break everything in his way kind of man. I don't much like Ares, but he, short temper, which crosses over some of the gods of war. You want something broken, killed, and done with, you send out Ares. He's not an assassin. Well, he's kind of an assassin for Zeus, for his dad. Okay. And then there's Athena, and we did talk about her in a different aspect last week. But Athena, as you said, is the strategist. You want somebody to go in and figure out where's the best place to hit a human army. Send Ares over here. I'll go over here and take the flank and whatever. She's got the bigger picture. He's just the blunt force object. who in some, depending on how one reads translations, takes some joy in it. Not as much as some of the other gods of war. I think he has less of a sense of humor, if that seems weird to say, but and then so when we get to some of those other ones, we can talk about that.
All right. So does he have a backstory? Like, you remember with Athena, a sheep kind of popped out of Zeus's head, and she had this really, this whole backstory. Does any of that happen with Ares, or is he just sort of there?
Well, he's there. I'm just looking at some of the notes that I typed. His backstory isn't nearly as interesting. I think he essentially is born and appears. In my memory, and I was looking back through things, and no, he's. I think the thing that I associate most with him, or that I've heard people, different scholars point out, is he's hungry. And I don't know if you ever encountered personalities like this in your time in the military. I have encountered very few former soldiers, veterans, who were hungry to fight once they'd gone through that, whether it was mock fights or real fights. I've encountered one or two who said, "Oh, yeah, that was just fun," and that kind of scares me. But that's Ares. It's not that it's fun, but he's hungry for the battle. Give me a battle. I feed on battle.
Yeah, and that's an interesting. It's kind of an interesting mindset. Like you said, I think that's a pretty accurate assessment, right? If you're in the armed forces, you see early in your career, you see people who have never experienced anything, and they act like they're hungry, right? But then once people tend to encounter things, and even in some training stuff, right? A lot of the training has gotten realistic enough where you can get, obviously it's not going to compare to the real thing, but it can get you close enough. I remember one of the things that we did was we had a simulation where they built this whole mock town, real buildings and everything you can go in and whatnot. And in that town, they took our regular M16 rifles, and rather than shooting real bullets, we were shooting chalk bullets.
Ouch.
Right. And so so going into it, the instructors were telling us, okay, well, it's just like paintball, right? But it's not, because a paintball gun shoots at 600 feet per second, and an M16 shoots at 3,600 feet per second. And chalk is a much harder projectile than paint. So we were watching the other groups come out who had gone before us with just whole arms purple, blood streaming down them from getting hit by these things. So immediately you're like, okay, I do not want to get hit. And, so we're planning out a strategy ahead of time, how things are going to go, and who our team members are going to be. Because, going into clearing buildings and doing these sorts of things, you have a particular order to the guys in your group. This guy's going to be the leader. This guy's going to be a point man. This guy's going to be the guy who kicks in the door, so on and so forth. This guy's going to be the rear security, whatever. So we had our whole team planned out. I was supposed to be the leader of the group. We get up to the door, so we're the next group to go in, and the guy who's running the thing says, okay, you're going to do this, you're going to do this, you're going to do this. And he mixes up the whole team, right? So I end up being the rear security guy now. So we go into the town, and they have all the buildings built. They have fog machines just pumping in fog, so you can't really see anything. And they're playing all these sounds of people screaming and gunfire and mortar attacks and all this stuff in the background real loud. And we start our mission looking for, as stereotypical as it's going to be, we had to capture a man wearing a red turban. Right? Okay. So we start going through, and our guys are clearing buildings and doing all this stuff. And the guy who they had chosen to be the leader of the group would have been all of our last choices, right? So they're going around clearing buildings. I'm doing the rear security. So while they're inside the buildings trying people, I'm watching the door as people are coming close. So actors in the scene come up to me as civilians, speaking gibberish, trying to offer me things, and I have to tell them, okay, please stay back, please go here, whatever. And then occasionally I'll get attacked while they're in the building. So there's just me and 3 or 4 guys are coming, and I have to find cover to hide behind, and you hear these chalk things just hit whack, hitting off the walls and stuff, and all of a sudden your blood is pumping. You're like, oh my gosh, like I do not like, the things you would think like, oh, this is going to be fun, or, I'm going to do something really cool. All of a sudden, you're very afraid. And there's moments where doing something that you think this would be very cowardly in real life, you think, no, this is something for self-preservation right now,
Yeah.
And then you have to override that. You have to realize, okay, well, I'm not going to preserve myself because doing that puts my other guys in danger, right? So then you start trying to, and you don't think of that act as bravery. That's just something that you have to do. So you start kind of shooting back and maneuvering and doing different things. And long story short, our leader in the group, just for the comical wrap up to the story, our leader of the group had ended up killing the guy with the red turban within the first 5 seconds we had been in there in the simulation. And then the rest of the simulation ended up playing out by him taking the wrong exit out of a building, killing the other 4 members of the group, and then I had to escape through a town square, getting shot at. So I was the only one to survive. So it was so it was an interesting. So they all came back bloody and welted and purple, and we had lost immediately. So it was interesting. But and along aside, just to say. War is really, once you're in it, it's something completely different from the movies or how it's imagined. And concepts of cowardice or bravery are really out the window to things more accurately represented as self-preservation or self-sacrifice, for different good.
Now, this is a really, first, it's an illuminating story, and you've told me more this time. You told me this story once, but you've added some interesting things, and that's what I love about story, because more details emerge. But what you just hit on, the human realization, a duty. I have a duty to the team, or I have a duty to the unit, or you're not thinking in terms of cowardice and heroism and so on, courage. And then you look at a story such as the Iliad, and the long fight against trying to take over Troy. The Greeks battling the Trojans on the field every day, and the gods intruding. And whenever the gods intrude, they disguise themselves as some humans important to the person that they're intruding with, who usually insult them, who usually say to the human, "How you're a disgrace to your father. Your father fought in these battles and did these." So this whole side history, right. A tangent, and all to say, you ought to get out there and try to begin to live up to that kind of courage. It's not human.
Right.
It's goading.
Yeah, and you think about Ares, like we talked about a little bit so far, the way he's brutal, the way he's insatiable, the way he kind of hungers for battle and all this sort of stuff, that's not a human thing normally, outside of a really pretty severe mental disorder.
Yeah.
That's really not the way human soldiers think about things, because there's a mortality aspect to it, not just for you, but for your friends and for other, other people. Because
you're not going to come back the way some go. The other interesting thing about Ares, you did ask about it's not the same kind of story as Athena, but there is a bit of a parallel, and that is, and this isn't dramatic, but Hera has him without Zeus's help. She has some magical herbs. So here's the ultimate male war being, but his dad really isn't his dad. Well, here's Athena, born out of Zeus's head, but so she doesn't really have a mom,
right?
And I'm not suggesting that that's true for every single, but this is one of those things we look at in this kind of conversation.
Yeah.
So what else seems human in psychological terms that might affect how these beings approach things?
Right. Yeah, then there's so much stuff like that with all of these words. There's always these little things where you think,
because people keep adding details because they make up the story.
Yeah. So probably the other thing that I'd like to mention about Ares before we move on is he has his sons, and his sons' names in the Greek stand for fear and terror.
Strife.
Yeah, and so
and Ares.
Yeah, so that kind of highlights as well. Sort of the personality of Ares. And, another thing too is that you talked about how you didn't like Ares. I'm not sure the Greeks did either, because in a lot of his stories revolve around him being humiliated in some aspect or another. So, it almost makes you wonder if there's a message inherent in the story of Ares. I think a lot of it is resisting.
Resist being this brutal, no matter what you... Right, because again, you hear Ares doesn't show up in that many stories, whether he was edited out over years by cultural collective decision making on a conscious level, whatever. But I think you're onto something with it. When it's the sheer brutality, it's not all that interesting.
Yeah, there's an element of it doesn't show up often, but when he does, you have to kind of resist being him. Yeah. So let's move on. So for the Norse, we talked about it a little bit, and it's sort of a problem with the Norse trying to figure out who the war god is, because there's so many of them, and in a lot of cases, I think a lot of people would kind of peg Odin as being the war god. We already covered him in our King of the Gods.
Well, we did, but you and I talked about, so there's a Tyr or Tyr, some people put, but the Tyr's I usually encountered it, and then there's Thor. But the interesting thing is, I think that the Norse, and I interrupted you and I shouldn't have, but the Norse, I just want to put this on the table. There's a kind of class structure for these gods. Thor is often represented as the god of the people, the on the ground folks, and Odin is the god, the elite. Odin wants knowledge. Odin seeks poetry and the ability to create art, and as we said before, he watches the world and everything. But he can fight. He's a great destroyer, but he's not on that level with Thor or Tyr.
So, it's interesting, and this is where we get into you can't draw parallels between the stories 100%, right? Thor almost acts kind of like a demigod for the Greeks, right? He's kind of there among the people. But at the same time, Thor has a lot of the characteristics of Zeus, kind of being, the god of thunder and having, some of these other characteristics. So he kind of, I think that there's a lot of evidence that these characters were developed, from their own cultural beginnings in a lot of points.
Thor is also a other side note, but because we, if you're breathing, you probably are somewhat vaguely aware of Thor as a character in movies. Doesn't mean you have to like him, doesn't mean you go to those movies and whatever, but and some of the movies of late have gone to the humorous, somewhat almost doltish side of Thor, which is really true to the stories.
Right.
I mean, so there's one of the stories about Thor, god of thunder. He can blast you to cinders. He has two goats, flying goats. They never put those in the movie, thankfully. Who he slaughters at night, eats, wraps their bones up in their skin, and in the morning, he or his helpers, these two young people that he has, Thialfi is one of them, has to arrange the bones properly in the skin so that the goat will come back to life. And one day the boy is helping Thor, and he doesn't get the. He'd had a bite himself out of the marrow of one of the, and so the goat has a limp, and Thor goes crazy, yelling. But Thor, there's a cross-dressing Thor story.
Right? Yeah, that's the one that I was thinking of. Is that it was a frost giant, right? Thinks it's Thor's sister, and he's gonna marry him and stuff. And Thor the whole time is just kind of like rolling his eyes, trying to put up with it till it's the right time.
Because he wants his hammer back.
Right? Yeah.
Right. So Loki always makes a mess out of Thor, but in the broader. What's interesting to me is that Thor, when you look at the old stories and some of the scholarship about these things, Thor is the protector of the people on the ground, of the villages and the tribes. He can also vent his wrath if you don't give him enough to drink or whatever. Tyr, and this is appropriate to our own time in the political dialogue, but Tyr is essentially the war god of law and order. So Tyr's mission is not the same thing as Thor's.
Yeah, and we see that too as we get into a lot of these different ones, especially with the Japanese or the Hindu as well, that
yes,
the different war gods have vastly different missions that at times can even put them at odds with each other, and again, that's pretty true to life, in a lot of cases. Somebody who has the interests of one group at heart may not have the interest of another group at heart, even if they're people of the same culture or people of the same nation.
You've just hit on the essence of Joseph Campbell had this wonderful essay in his larger book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, and in this he points out that what can seem just for one culture is stories about war gods and stories about battle and war itself. We're trying to protect us rather than protect the world. We're trying to do a concentration on nations in which everyone else, and this is the ancient. I'm not talking about us now, but it applies. It's that when you're focused on a tribal unit or a nation of some kind, and your cult system makes a god of a particular attribute, then you can justify all kinds of things in the name of the protecting the people in that circle rather than what's best for the entire world as you know it. That's why I think these stories are still more than ever applicable now, when you have fragmented units of people who here's a figurehead, whatever, and this person, everyone else is villainized into subhumanity for the sake of law and order, whatever that concept is supposed to mean. And what you're doing is really invoking ancient story. Mm-hmm. And the law and order isn't so pretty, depending on which side of the needs you are.
Yeah, again, we're getting into law and order. If you think about it, especially in regards to military and war, is it's about establishing a hierarchy, right? It's kind of like a wolf pack, right? You're trying to establish who fulfills what role. And again, I'm not going to tell military stories the entire show, but I'll give you one more because it really is a microcosm of this sort of thing, right? You have each war god has a different, sort of a different personality to it, and it might put them at odds with other war gods. But the ultimate goal is the good of the people, right? Mm-hmm. And the Army's kind of similar. I remember in basic training, we do hand-to-hand combat, right? You get trained on it throughout the entire 10 weeks. I don't know. I don't even know if they do it anymore, honestly, because they're kind of phasing out some aspects of it when I went through it. But so the whole 9 weeks, you do hand-to-hand combat, and you spar with these people and stuff, and you do these things. And the last thing that we did was pugil sticks, which is kind of, if you're familiar with like American Gladiator, that sort of thing. It's the giant cotton swabs, right, that you fight each other with. Yeah. So that was the last thing, and it was sort of for fun. You'd gone through all the training, all the tests and stuff. Now, at the end, they were just going to kind of let you play with these things. But the drill instructor who was in charge of it was a pretty sadistic sort of dude to begin with. And on top of that, he said that everybody's going to participate, and those who tried not to were going to have a bad time. Right? I really didn't want to. So, we're standing in a circle, watching, and then each round, he'd ask for volunteers, and 2 people would show up, they'd fight each other. And then, around you'd go. So after about an hour or so of this, he's looking around and saying, okay, cool. Who hasn't gone yet? Right. Nobody's raising their hand. And then he spots me and he says, you haven't gone yet and you didn't raise your hand. And he said, so you're going to go. And he said, you're going to go against the Widowmaker, which is this guy. His last name was Whitaker, and he happened to be 6'5" and probably pretty close to 300 pounds.
Oh boy.
But they called him the Widowmaker, right? Yeah. So we put on all the pads. But the thing is, and it wasn't just me who didn't raise my hand. There's a few other people, and all of them were what I'd say varying levels of not character, but appetites for violence, let's say.
Okay.
So some of them got destroyed, for lack of a better term, against much larger, hungrier opponents for not volunteering. I think the difference for me was that throughout the entire hour beforehand, I had been watching the matches. And so I'd identified a certain preference that the fighters had taken. You would put on all these pads, including a helmet, and go out. And it kind of restricted some of your movement. So you were they were just hitting back and forth, kind of a rowing motion, hitting into the shoulders, right? So they put me in there against the Widowmaker. And so I did my best to look real scared and kind of cowering. And when they said go, he came running at me, just ready to put me in the ground. So all I did was act like I was cowering a little bit and shift my shoulders towards him. And then when he got close, I just took the end of the stick and just jammed it up under his chin, and he fell out cold. And so I ended up winning the match. But, again, so that story sort of highlights different. It's representative of different war gods almost, right?
Absolutely.
You have your Ares and you have your
So were you Ares or were you Tyr?
No, I think the Widowmaker was Ares. And I think the Tyr is probably the drill instructor. Okay. He's the war god of law and order. He's the one who's trying to establish who is where in the hierarchy, who's going to fulfill what roles in the units going forward, because after that point we go on missions, right? And you have 5-man teams. Who's going to be the leader? Who's going to be the heavy machine gunner? Who's going to be these sorts of people? And that's really where I got established as a team leader, right? Is, you pick up on qualities. Okay, well, this guy he does not have an appetite for violence, but he'll do what he needs to do to get something done. So there's, so different roles, right?
It's a great story though, because it's you. See, and and in my mind, hearing your story, I think of you as Tyr-like, perhaps even Odin-like. But Tyr is known for prudence and wisdom, and it takes wisdom to act like something else to mislead your opponent. Loki is no god of war. He's just a trickster. He would just mislead and then cheat.
Right.
Right. You didn't do that. Odin is maybe Odin qualities in the sense of watching, taking the information in. So your eyes are the birds coming to whisper in your ears. That's where they're whispering in your eyes. Okay. And then one stroke. Thor is just bash, crash with the hammer, and you didn't do that. So, but isn't it interesting to think of a story like that, or think of yourself, even if this is what Campbell was trying to have us do, and this is what philosophy tries to have us do, is to take the story and then what do we see in ourselves freshly because of the stories that we're talking about?
Right. Yeah. What is your own mythology? What do the stories say about you, and how do you write your own story in that sort of way?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you definitely learn things about yourself. You learn real quick. I'm not a Hercules. I'm not, I'm not the one that's going to go in there by brute force and accomplish anything,
Right.
And that might seem obvious to some people, but it's not obvious to everybody, because I'm not a small person. I'm not a weak person.
No, you're
so
not.
I could quite easily think that I am a Hercules, but then as you encounter other people, and the wider you start to establish the wider skill set, not of just people in general, but especially a specific category of people, warriors, right? And again, it comes back to a very primitive interaction,
which is what the Iliad is like. There you are. You're at the primitive. Who are the over and over again in this kind of mythology? The warriors are giants. Well, what do we do in our movies? We get these actors who are large. We make them larger. We build them up and build them so that we're standing next to people, even people who are in good shape. Well, they don't look like anything like a warrior. Why? Because a warrior's got to be this ultra sized being for some reason. That's ancient. That's primitive. But your story shows that that's not necessarily true.
Yeah, and how it plays out in reality isn't necessarily true. I remember reading an interview with Chris Evans, who plays Captain America, right?
Yeah.
And they were asking him about his workout routine, and he was saying how they had him doing all this weightlifting and stuff. And they asked him about cardio. He said, no, I don't do any cardio, because that would reduce the amount of muscle mass that I have. So as a result, when they have him doing the scenes where he's filming and running and stuff, he said he's just totally winded after each scene because he's not used to doing it. Well, in war, that's not really a great... you need to be able to run. You need to be able to do these things. So lots of times, the great warriors are not the giants, or not the people that look the most intimidating. Warriors have a mixture of tangible and intangible elements that make them good at what they do.
And this is where the fantasy and the mythology, and we're really not off on a sidetrack. This is central to what we're talking about. This is where the fantasy of the mythology can get in the way of understanding ourselves better. Because, in fact, it's unlikely that you can be built an incredible chiseled muscularity of that. I mean, I see your arms when we talk. You could chisel, man. But you're talking about the Chris Evans stuff, but winded. We want in our fantasy to be able to be both big and flexible and fast, and that's not really possible.
Right.
Now we can either accept that as a fantasy and say, which one am I working on, and who am I, and what can this tell me about me? Or we can think of ourselves as being this impossible creature that we know we're not, and get ourselves into serious difficulty.
Yeah. And I mean, this is something that plays out, in mainstream culture all the time, and probably more so prevalently with women, right? You're subjected to these outside images of things that you should be. And, it's really not any different for men. It's just much lower key, right? You look at action figures, or you look at superheroes, and you're still presented with this unrealistic thing. And like you said, at some point in your life, you either have to accept that it's not a realistic thing, or you have to convince yourself that it is, and then get yourself into trouble.
Well, which is what you didn't do. You said, "I'm not the Widowmaker."
I'm not going to go. I'm not going to go punch for punch with this guy, because it's not going to. I'm not going to win.
I have to be wise. I have to be prudent. I have to be observant. I cannot be brute force.
Right.
And I think that's what some of the stories tell us when some of the gods of war fail and when they succeed. Because there is a learning thing going on. Thor has to learn things. He doesn't learn all that much. But if you read the whole body of stories, Neil Gaiman has this wonderful redoing of Norse mythology. It's called Norse mythology, and it's just brilliant. And it retells so many of these stories. And you do see that Thor he picks up some things, but he's still pretty much a lout. Not so much in the movies, but even in the movies, he becomes self-aware. But the moment that he starts becoming self-aware and steps away, finding himself falling out of what he thinks of himself, that's where his life goes all messy in the movie narratives. That's the interesting part.
Yeah. Yeah, so Thor, he's an interesting character, and again, he has a humorous element to him and all these things. So moving ahead, you're going to have to help me with this name, but we have the Hindu god of war, Kartikeya.
Yeah.
And so he's going to be vastly different from Ares or Thor. Because he's much more kind of along the lines of what we've just been talking about. He's more of a philosopher.
Yeah,
kind of warrior
he
guy.
is. He's the son of gods who are supposed to save the gods. So he's not. It's not this being is created and then we throw him out to destroy humans. We're back to the Hindu complexity. Right? So you probably read this version too, but I like this one. So Shiva and his wife Parvati created a being with 5 faces. A glowing spark emerged from each face. So just picture it. It's like bubbles. And then a bubble splits into a bubble, and so we have 5 faces. Spark from each face. The 5-faced being goes into the river, the Ganges River. The 5 sparks float out, each form a child. So we got a face that becomes a child, floating, each one different. Young women find them, they take them, they nurse them into childhood, and there we have that same thing. Moses in the basket. We have every mythological system has that kind of element. But then Shiva and Parvati take their children back. It was 1, but now it's many. They take them back, and they didn't know how they're going to take care of all of them. And so Shiva merged the children into one being with 6 heads, one for each of the children, representing the 5 senses, and a final head to combine the senses into one. So we don't have this big hulking widowmaker, this Thor with a hammer. We have a 6-headed being that started out as a 5-headed being that was split into 5 different people that is put back together with an extra head added to guide all the other aspects of that being. And you have to have all of that in order to defend the gods.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's a super complex story. And the other thing that's pretty interesting about it is that it's a very old story. Kind of like, again, reflecting what we were talking about, looking at the biological role that conflict and violence plays in life. Kartikeya is one of the most old integral stories in the Hindu religion.
It is. Yeah.
Something that really strikes me about him, and again, this gets back, into the deeper elements of what these gods stand for, is that they make a point of saying how he's ever youthful, right? Kartikeya is ever youthful. What do you think that says about warriors, about gods of war, about conflict?
I think that it's, well, and I may take it wrong. I mean, I'm not practicing, I don't practice Hinduism, but I've studied it. It's, and so I know it from the academic a little bit. But being 62 and being reminded, well, life reminds you, you're not 20 and whatever, but I also you come to realize over years of studying philosophy and thinking and just living that the useful aspect doesn't have to mean absolutely physical usefulness. Now, yes, he's represented this way, and that may well be the intent. But I think that if you say this God is a God of power and strength, but he's a God also of the 5 senses that are integrated through a 6th path. So usefulness is paying attention to your 5 senses and the wisdom to figure out where you're going and what you need to do. There's the youthfulness. Learning. For me, it's a story of learning. It's a story of mindfulness and power. He just got a spear. He also is on a peacock. How many other heroes do you know who would ride a peacock and be considered powerful and strong, right? We have chariots. Well, we have goats too. we have clouds that they float in on, and we're flying with hammers and everything. But peacocks, and which are beautiful birds, but which also can be fierce birds. So there can be beauty and ferocity. There can be wisdom and power, and all of those together suggest youth, literally, but they also suggest a kind of youthfulness, figuratively. Yeah.
He's just really one of the most complex characters we look at, right? Because I know that I look at it and I think, man, this could be saying so many different things, and I'm not sure what exactly what it is. But yeah.
Through the blessings of Lord Kartikeya, one can achieve great strength and get rid of all his woes. Well, okay, sure. Right. But his peacock represents him as the destroyer of all bad habits and a conqueror of overwhelming desires. Now, there's where there's an element of one might say Buddhism floating into this. There's that strange the flexible boundary with all that. But it's not just about going out and breaking things.
Yeah, it's almost as if what's being said is that he's the god of war, but really he's kind of a god of even inner war, inner conflict, right? So the ability to be self-disciplined, to wage your inner battles and overcome your bad habits or the things that you wrestle with yourself.
As a Westerner, that's how I take it. Now, that's someone who practices Hinduism would probably just
what are you guys
laugh uproariously. What are you talking about? And I would welcome that conversation because that again would be a learning conversation. But I think we can. If you can't understand a story in its own context, then you should try, because it arises out of a culture. So I'm not saying just forget all that. Let's just be Western. But I think that also powerful stories will speak to many different cultural contexts and help us be better within ourselves, even if we don't necessarily practice the cultural rituals and norms of a theological system.
Right. Yeah, and we've talked about it in the past with art forms, right? Whether you're writing a song or painting a picture or writing a story, that lots of times, especially as somebody who does a lot of those things myself, people come up to me and say, "Oh yeah, this is what I think that, this is what this means to me." And it's probably 90 to 95% of the time something completely different than what I meant when I was writing the story, right? But that's fine, because like you said, I think that they're using it to draw an insight into their own lives. Now, obviously, there's a more sensitive nature to religious and theological stories.
But the thing you just said, the wisdom in that little kernel is, if we hear somebody say, somebody says to you, and you've heard this as an artist, this is what this means to me. That's far enough.
Yeah.
Right?
What am I going to do? Say, no, this is what it actually meant.
Well, if you're Aries, yes. No, you're wrong. No, this is what it means. The fact that it means something, that meaning is being made. The old English going on. I'm making my meaning. I think that's the most exciting thing. That some process, some dynamic relationship, even within the mind of someone who hears the music, has taken place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, it's that, it's inner conflict, right? Mm-hmm. You're bringing in new information, and you have cognitive dissonance, and then you're settling it with with your other settled information and creating something new.
And you've integrated that spark. You've integrated one of those heads into
yeah. The symbolism is there. So we might be completely wrong, but I like it. So let's move on to Mantu. So it's the Egyptian war god.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about Mantu?
All right. Some war gods have sacred animals, so bull and a falcon in his case. I don't know, to be honest, I don't know many stories about Mantu, really. But because of the ancientness, I think some of these characters, just like Saga, when we were talking about the goddess of knowledge and wisdom, but also writing, we know attributes. It's like I don't want to trivialize it, but it's like going into a game, finding a playing card. Here's the attributes of this character.
Right.
But without a story, so then you end up telling the story. I think Mantu would probably be a good character in this. I don't know this game. You might. Gods of War.
Yeah.
I know there's a game out there.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think part of that is making up stories.
Yeah.
With them. But what we know is a two-plumed crown, a falcon head, or a helmet that's a falcon head, but usually a physical falcon head. Well, there was something I wanted to... a balancing force between two conflicting aspects of life, a symbol of duality, because he's protecting the Egyptian entity, but he's also enforcing order. So
right.
We're back to that again.
Yeah, and so the Egyptian story, it has a nice symbolism to it because Mantu is the destructive aspect of Ra.
Yeah.
Right. So you look at the sun god Ra. For a pasty white guy like me, it's probably the sunburn, right? That's Mantu. He has the destructive aspect. But, there's a duality there, right? Because I might go out in the sun and get a sunburn, but I might get that sunburn tending to the crops that ultimately feed me that are created by the sun, So there's the duality. And in war, there's that duality as well. You might... again, there's the destructive aspect where you're going to lose men in battle. Mothers are going to lose sons and wives are going to lose husbands and stuff in battle. But ultimately, if you succeed in defending your homeland or taking new territory or whatever, there's an aspect that feeds the culture, Yes. So that's what I like about Mantu is that I think that duality is very present. They don't hide there's no glossing over the destructive aspects of it while talking about the positive aspects.
Yeah. I like where you're going with that because it does tie back to your stories. It ties back to but it also goes back to Campbell because I think that the most ancient of stories that are actually stories, like the Iliad again, and the war gods and all kinds of gods intruding. Essentially, the queen of a very powerful king in Greece goes with the ruler of Troy. War is launched because of a relationship. And time again, the soldiers, the warriors, Odysseus and the rest of them gather in council and say, why are we doing this? Is this, we've been doing this for years. Are we doing this to bring her back to the king? Is it that, or is it loot? And it is loot. Treasure for us, bring back the boats and the armor and all that. Or is it glory for the Achaeans or the Greeks, or glory for the Trojans? And so they keep morphing or losing sight of, well, not losing sight of the sight of the original reason seems to be less and less meaningful. And in the Greek gods of war, essentially slap the humans up the side of the head and say, "You're here to be warriors and do this. This was why you came, and this is what you're going to do." Perhaps a drill sergeant in some way that way. But I think beings like Mantu, with this duality that you were just describing so well, I think they cause us to realize that as stories grow to be more sophisticated, or as the people who are reading or hearing about these beings, not sophisticated, are more aware of the larger world in some ways, perhaps. We can't be ancient Greeks.
Right.
That we realize that maybe the reasons for war have to be seriously reconsidered.
Yeah. And, there's a lot of modern parallels to all of that. You can think about all the ways that is reflective of, the modern culture that we live in. But yeah, I think that is the strength of Mantu is kind of that reminder, okay, there's positive and there's negative aspects. Where are you finding this balance point, Let's look at our last one, which is one of the Japanese gods of war, Hachiman.
Yeah.
Okay. And he's another one that's pretty interesting, and there's some parallels you can draw between him and Kartikeya.
What do you see is similar to him and Kartikeya? Because I agree with you. They're there. Those.
Yeah, I think that there's a knowledge aspect behind them. Hachiman, he's generally less considered the god of war than the teacher of warriors, really.
Good. Yes.
So there's the instructional aspect, the wisdom aspect. The other thing I find interesting about him is he's also looked at as the god of archery or fishing or agriculture, right? And so I think that there's an overarching theme of life cycles there, right? There's a birth, and then there's a culling, for lack of a better word, that happens among all of these things, whether it's war or fishing or agriculture. There's this raising up, and then kind of a cultivating sort of thing. What can you tell us about him? Let's start with what he's best known for,
which is the use of destructive winds called kamikaze, fierce wind, fiery spirited wind, which, World War II, people would talk about the kamikaze, but it goes back to the samurai warrior aspect. So essentially, as I understand it, as a warrior, you have to be precise. Thus, the archery. So that's why the famous book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance was followed up by Zen and the Art of Archery. And I am not an archer. I like archer characters. I do shoot arrows occasionally in a bale of straw. And that's fun because it's focused in a different way than I think shooting a gun is. I've done that because it feels more. I'm not talking about super duper high tech bows. Talking about you're going to feel the wind. You're not going to have mechanisms to help you guide it in a telescopic lens. It's just the bow, your arm strength, the aim, the eye, all of it together. Hammer with sword, it doesn't. I mean, it takes strength, of course, right? But that doesn't sort of work. And the spear, which the Greeks used a lot, in which Mantu is known for. I'm not denying the spear is an awful weapon. It's a powerful weapon, but I think there's more of a process that archery involves. So Hashiman's primary purpose is in Shinto, in the Japanese belief of Shinto, which says it's really humanistic, We aren't all good. We aren't all bad. We have this constant wrestling with ourselves. But the badness, the evil that we do find is often caused because we've let in kami, spirits of various kinds, millions of different kinds of spirits. And Hachiman, his goal is to battle the kami.
So yeah, there we're looking at that parallel with Kardikeya, right? Where it's, again, gods of war, but it's almost gods of internal war. You're fighting these internal battles,
That fiercely with wind of some kind inside. But
to me, that's a really interesting perspective that you don't see with the Western gods of war as much. There tends to be, it's all an external sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's just a real interesting kind of character.
And he's in the ancientness and the otherness of, I think it's also the otherness of the traditions that we look at. Even though we're not ancient Greek, we're more used to the ancient Greek. And so when you see something being more introspective, say, oh, I like that. It's new or fresh to us, or can be. Have you done archery?
Yeah, I've done a little bit. It is different. It's especially different for me because I have mixed dominance, which is where I have a dominant left leg and left eye, but a dominant right arm, which leads to some weird things. I shoot a rifle right-handed, but I shoot a bow left-handed.
Interesting.
So I struggle with it.
Also sounds like elements of a god of war, though. I use this weapon this way, but I use this weapon.
Yeah. But no, I think it's interesting, right? Because you say that, we're more habituated to these Western gods, the Norse and the Greek and stuff. But really, they have a different culture from us as well. They have an undeniable influence on our stories. Mm-hmm. And America is not an old nation. But I think that's kind of an interesting exercise in philosophy that we might want to save for another time, is looking at what is the American mythology, right? What do we, what do our gods of war are, heavily influenced by the Greeks and the Norse, but I think there'd be totally different aspects to our characters, what they say.
Neil Gaiman's book that I keep coming back to, it's called American Gods. And it's about the ancient gods. And we can talk about this someday, but just, it's gods of every tradition, all brought to these shores because we're migrants, we're immigrants. We all have come from immigrants, and so all the little household gods and the large and the all mix it up. But the American gods are killing off some of the other gods. The American gods are the gods of capitalism and technology. And I won't go further with it, but that's there are physical iterations of these things.
Yeah, I haven't read the book, but I can see parallels between a god of capitalism and a god of war. I can tell you, I can definitely see some things that would be comparable. All right, so it was a great talk, and until next time, keep pondering.